The monster had given her until 11 o'clock in the evening. He had chosen his time well. There would be many people, many members of the human race up there in the resplendent theater. That what finer night could be expected for his funeral. He would go down to the tomb escorted by the whitest shoulders in the world, decked with the richest jewels. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. We were all to be blown up in the middle of the performance, if Christine Daae said no. 11 o'clock in the evening? And what else could Christine say but no? Would she not prefer to exploit death itself rather than that living corpse? She did not know that on her acceptance or refusal depended the awful fate of many members of the human race. 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. And we dragged ourselves through the darkness, feeling our way to the stone steps for the light in the trapdoor overlay that led the room of mirrors was now extinguished, and repeated to ourselves, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening. At last I found the staircase, but suddenly I drew myself up on the first step, for a terrible thought had come to my mind. What is the time? Ah, what was the time? For after all, 11 o'clock tomorrow evening mightn't be now. Might be this very moment. Who could tell us the time? We seem to have been imprisoned in that hell for days and days, for years, since the beginning of the world. Perhaps we should be blown up then and there. Ah, a sound. A crack! Did you hear that? There in the corner. Good heavens! Sounds like machinery. Again. Oh, for the light. Oh, for a light. Perhaps it's the machinery that is to blow up everything. I tell you, a crackling sound. Are you deaf? Monsieur de Chagny and I began to yell like madmen, fear spurring us on. We rushed up the treads of the staircase, stumbling as we went, anything to escape the dark, to return to the moral light of the room of mirrors. We found the trapdoor still open, but it was now as dark in the room of mirrors as in the cellar which we had left. We dragged ourselves along the floor of the torture chamber, the floor that separated us from the powder magazine. What was the time? We shouted, we called. Monsieur de Chagny to Christine. I to Eric. I reminded him that I had saved his life, but no answer. Save that of our despair, our madness. What was the time? We argued. We tried to calculate the time which we had spent there, but we were incapable of reasoning. If only we could see the face of a watch. Mine had stopped, and Monsieur de Chagny was still going. But Monsieur de Chagny's was still going. He told me that he had wound it up before dressing for the opera. We had not a match on us, and yet we must know. Monsieur de Chagny broke the glass of his watch and felt the two hands. He questioned the hands of the watch with his fingers tips, going by the position of the ring of the watch, judging by the space between the hands. he thought it might just be 11 o'clock. But perhaps it was not 11 o'clock, of which he stood in dread. Perhaps we had still 12 hours before us. Suddenly I exclaimed, "Hush!" I seemed to hear footsteps in the next room. Someone tapped against the wall. Christine's voice said, "Raoul! Raoul!" We were now all talking at once on either side of the wall. Christine sobbed. She was not sure that she should find Monsieur de Chandy alive. The monster had been terrible. It seemed had done nothing but rave, wanting for her to give him the yes, which she refused, and yet she had promised him that yes, if he would take her to the torture chamber. But he had obstinately declined and had uttered hideous threats against all members of the human race. At last, hours and hours of that hell, he had that moment gone out, leaving her alone to reflect for one last time. Hours and hours. What is the time now? What is the time, Christine? It is 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock. All but 5 minutes. But which 11 o'clock? The 11 o'clock that is to decide life or death. He has told me so just before he went. He is terrible. He is quite mad. He tore off his mask. Ah, that's better. Thank you, Christine. And his yellow eyes shot flames. He did nothing but laugh. He said, "I give you 5 minutes to spare your blushes. Here," he said, taking a key from the little bag of life and death. "Here is the little bronze key that opens the 2 ebony caskets on the mantelpiece in the Louis Philippe room. In one of the caskets you will find a scorpion, and in the other a grasshopper, both very cleverly imitated in Japanese bronze. They will say yes or no for you. If you turn the scorpion round, that will mean to me, when I return, that you have said yes." The grasshopper will mean no. And he laughed like a drunken demon. I did nothing but beg and entreat him to give me the key of the torture chamber, promising to be his wife if he granted me that request. But he told me that there was no future needed for that key, and that he was going to throw it into the lake. And he laughed again, like a drunken demon, and left me. Oh, his last words were, "The grasshopper! Be careful of the grasshopper. A grasshopper does not only turn, it hops. It hops. And it hops jolly high." The 5 minutes had nearly elapsed, and the scorpion and the grasshopper were scratching at my brain. Nevertheless, I had sufficient lucidity left to understand that if the grasshopper had turned, it would hop, and with it the many members of the human race. There was no doubt, but that the grasshopper controlled an electric current intended to blow up the powder magazine. Monsieur de Chandy, who seemed to have recovered all his moral force from hearing Christine's voice, exclaimed to her in a few hurried words the situation in which we and all the opera were. He told her to turn the scorpion at once. There was a pause. Christine? I cried. Where are you? By the scorpion. Don't touch it! The idea had come to me, for I knew, my Eric, that the monster had perhaps deceived the girl once more. Perhaps it was the scorpion that would blow up everything. After all, why wasn't he there? 5 minutes was long past, and he was not back. Perhaps he had taken shelter and was waiting for the explosion. Why had he not returned? He could not really expect Christine ever to consent to become his voluntary prey. Why had he not returned? Don't touch the scorpion, I said. Here he comes, cried Christine. I hear him. Here he is. We heard his steps approaching the Louis Philippe room. He came up to Christine, but did not speak. Then I raised my voice. Eric, it is I. Do you know me? With extraordinary calmness, he at once replied, So, you are not dead in there? Well then, see that you keep quiet. I tried to speak, but he said coldly, Not a word, Degora, or I shall blow up everything. And he added, The honor rests with Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle has not touched the scorpion. How deliberately he spoke. Mademoiselle has not touched the grasshopper. With that composure. But it is not too late to do the right thing. There, I opened the caskets without a key, for I am a trapdoor lover, and I open and shut what I please and as I please. I open the little ebony caskets. Mademoiselle, look at the little dears inside. Aren't they pretty? If you turn the grasshopper, mademoiselle, we shall all be blown up. There is enough gunpowder under our feet to blow up a whole quarter of Paris. If you turn the scorpion, mademoiselle, all that powder will be soaked and drowned. Mademoiselle, to celebrate our wedding, you shall make a very handsome present to a few hundred Parisians. There we go. Who are at this moment applauding a poor masterpiece of Meyerbeer's. You shall make them a present of their lives. For with your own fair hands you shall turn the scorpion, and merrily, merrily will be married. A pause, and then, if in 2 minutes, mademoiselle, you have not turned the scorpion, I shall turn the grasshopper. And the grasshopper, I tell you, hops jolly high. A terrible silence began anew. The Viscount de Chagny realized that there was nothing left to do but pray. Went down on his knees and prayed. As for me, my blood beat so fiercely that I had to take my heart in both hands, lest it should burst. At least we heard Eric's voice. The 2 minutes are past. Goodbye, mademoiselle. Hop, grasshopper! Eric! Cried Christine. Do you swear to me, monster? Do you swear to me that the scorpion is the one to turn? Yes, to hop at our wedding. Ah, you see, you said to hop. At our wedding, ingenious child. The scorpion opens the ball. That will do. You won't have the scorpion. Then I turn the grasshopper. Eric! Enough! I was crying out of concern with Christine. Monsieur de Chany was still on his knees praying. Eric, I have turned the scorpion. On the second through which we passed, waiting to find ourselves in fragments, amid the roar and the ruins, feeling something crack beneath our feet, hearing an appalling hiss through the open trap door, a hiss like the first sound of a rocket. It came softly at first, then louder, then very loud, but it was not the hiss of a fire. It was more like the hiss of water. And now it became a gurgling sound. We rushed to the trapdoor, all of our thirst which vanished. Then the terror came, now returned with the lapping of water. The water rose in the cellars above the barrels, the powder barrels. Barrels! Barrels! Any barrels to sell? And we went down to it with parched throats. It rose to our chins, to our mouths, and we drank. We stood on the floor of the cellar and drank. We went up the stairs again. In the dark, step by step, went up the water. The water came out of the cellar with us and spread over the floor of the room. If this went on, the whole house on the lake would be swamped. The floor of the torture chamber had itself become a regular little lake, in which our feet splashed. Surely there was enough water now. Eric must turn off the tap. Eric! Eric! That is enough water for the gunpowder. Turn off the tap. Turn off the scorpion. But Eric did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. It was halfway to our waists. Christine! Cried Monsieur de Chany. Christine, the water is up to our knees. But Christine did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. No one in the room, no one in the next room, no one to turn the tap, no one to turn the scorpion. We were all alone in the dark, with the dark water that seized us and clasped us and froze us. Eric! Eric! Christine! Christine! By this time, we had lost our foothold and were spinning around in the water, carried away by an irresistible whirl, for the water turned with us and dashed us against the dark mirror, which thrust us back again, and our throats raised above the whirlpool roared aloud. Were we to die here, drowned in the torture chamber? I had never seen that Eric. At the time of the rosy hours of Mazenderan had never shown me that through the little invisible window. "Eric! Eric!" I cried. "I saved your life, remember? You were sentenced to death, but for me, you would be dead. But for me, you would be dead now, Eric." He whirled around the water like so much wreckage. But suddenly, my straying hand seized the trunk of the iron tree. I called Monsieur Duchesne, and we both hung to the branch of the iron tree. And the water rose higher still. Oh, can you remember how much space is there between the branch of the tree and the dome-shaped ceiling? Do you remember? After all, the water may stop. It must find its level. There, I think it is stopping. No! Oh, horrible! Swim for your life! Our arms became entangled in the effort of swimming. We choked. We fought in the dark water. Already we could hardly breathe the dark air above. The dark water, the air which escaped, which we could hear escaping through some vent hole or other. Oh, let us turn and turn and turn until we find the air hole and then glue our mouths to it. But I lost my strength. I tried to lay hold of the walls. Oh, how those glass walls slipped from under my groping fingers. We whirled around again. We began to sink. One last effort, a last cry. "Eric! Christine!" In our ears. At the bottom of the dark water, our ears went. And before losing consciousness, I seemed to hear between the gargles, "Barrels, barrels, empty barrels." Okay. There we go. Okay. Chapter 26. The end of the ghost's love story. The previous chapter marks the conclusion of the written narrative which the Persian left behind. Notwithstanding the horrors of the situation, which seemed definitely to abandon them to their deaths, Monsieur Duchesne and his companion were saved by the sublime devotion of Christine Daae, and I had the rest of the story from the lips of the Daroga himself. When I went to see him, he was still living in his little flat in the Rue de Rivola, opposite the Tuileries. He was very ill, and it required all my ardor as an historian pledged to the truth to persuade him to live the incredible tragedy over again for my benefit. His faithful old servant Darius showed me in to him. The Dragonia received me at the window overlooking the garden of the tall trees. He still had his magnificent eyes, but his poor face looked very worn. He had shaved the whole of his head, which was usually covered with the Astrakhan cap. He was dressed in a long plain coat and amused himself by unconsciously twisting his thumbs inside the sleeves. But his mind was quite clear, and he told me his story with perfect lucidity. It seems that when he opened his eyes,
The Dragoner found himself lying on a bed. Monsieur de Chagny was on a sofa. Beside the wardrobe, an angel and a devil were watching over them. The deceptions and illusions of the torture chamber, the precision of the details of that quiet little middle-class room seemed to have been invented for the express purpose of puzzling the mind of the mortal rash enough to stray into the abode of a living nightmare. The wooden bedstead, the waxy mahogany chairs, the chest of drawers, those brasses, the little square antimacassars carefully placed on the backs of chairs, the clock on the mantelpiece, and the harmless-looking ebony caskets at either end. Lastly, the whatnot filled with shells, with red pin cushions, with mother-of-pearl boats, and an enormous ostrich egg, the whole discreetly lighted by a shaded lamp, standing on a small round table. This collection of ugly, peaceable, reasonable furniture at the bottom of the opera cellars bewildered the imagination more than all the late fantastic happenings. The figure of the masked man seemed all the more formidable in this old-fashioned, neat, and trim little frame. I bent down over the Persian and said in his ear, only seems right to put this back on. Ah, phooey. You know what, I'll just hold it. He came to himself long before we knew if you were still alive, Dragana. He is quite well. He's asleep. We must not wake him. Eric left the room for a moment, and the Persian raised himself on his elbow, looking around him, and saw Christine Daae sitting by the fireside. He spoke to her, called her. But he was still very weak and fell back on the pillows. Christine came to him, laid her hands on his forehead, and went away. The Persian remembered that, as she went, she did not give a glance to Monsieur de Chagny, who, it is true, was sleeping peacefully, and she sat down again in her chair by the chimney cover, silent as a sister of charity who had taken a vow of silence. Eric returned with some little bottles, which he placed on the mantelpiece, and again he, in a whisper, so as to not wake Monsieur de Chagny, he had said to the Persian, after sitting down and feeling his pulse, "You are now saved, both of you, and soon I shall take you up to the surface of the earth to please my wife." Thereupon he rose without any further explanation and disappeared once more. The Persian now looked at Christine quite profile under the lamp. She was reading a tiny book with gilt edges, like a religious book. There are the editions of the Immutation that look like that. The Persian still had in his ears the natural tone in which